What's going on YouTube and Diablo fans? My name's Andreas and as always welcome back to Mana and Motherboards. Today's video is going to be a little follow on from yesterday's deep dive into the PTR and patch notes for this patch 3.2 in the Reign of the Warlock expansion here for Diablo 2 Resurrected. So in this video what we are going to be focusing on is specifically looking at how the Echoing Strike build is affected by the bug fixes and nerfs and changes that they intend to implement in this patch 3.2 and PTR that they're going to be testing. So let's just quickly choose our scene where we'd like to be in the World of Sanctuary here. I think Act 2 is a good little spot. Anyway, diving right into the meat and potatoes of this video and what's going on. So the first major change that has been announced by Blizzard for the patch 3.2 is that the bug where Echoing Strike wasn't doing a roll to hit, that wasn't doing a hit check, is now going to be fixed. So if we very quickly look at the skill here of Echoing Strike, you can see how it provides attack rating on the skill itself, and it was always intended that Echoing Strike was going to require a hit check, a hit roll in order to hit enemies. And what that basically boils down to, very simply, is that the build wasn't using attack rating in the current state of the game, and it will now require attack rating in order to hit. Now this is going to change everything for this character. It's going to change the gear that you use in terms of getting attack rating from your gear. It's going to change the skills that you use in order to get a better attack rating to hit your enemies with this Echoing Strike skill. And it just creates so much more thought and processes of building your character and how you sort of theory craft and work with the meta of this particular skill and character. So there's just so much more nuance going into your thought process of building an Echoing Strike Warlock now than there was before. So one way that you can sort of get around this new, you would call it a nerf, but it was actually a bug fix, is using skills like Sigil Lethargy, which, as you can see here, they minus defense from your... I just got DC'd from the game. Anyway, on Sigil Lethargy, you can see how it minuses defense from your enemies within the radius of Sigil Lethargy, so that will help you hit your enemies. You can also use skills like Hex Purge and Hex Bane, which also add attack rating to your attacks, and these are just two ways that you can sort of help out this new change, or help out in getting AR to combat the requirement of attack rating in the Echoing Strike build now. So that is going to be overall a net damage loss, because you now have to account for attack rating and put attack rating on your gear slots, where before you never really had to think about it, so you never had to put any gear that gave you attack rating on. So that is going to change a lot in the meta and a lot in the Warlock building for Echoing Strike. So that is the first major change that they have made and a bug fix that they have fixed. The next one is now that Echoing Strike will use durability on your weapon. So in the past, like for instance, I mean, let's just take Obsession for instance here. I mean, it is indestructible, so it doesn't matter. But now Echoing Strike uses durability, which it never used to. So where you used to be able to use any ethereal weapon, you now have to consider that it has to be indestructible if it's ethereal, or it needs to be a weapon that isn't ethereal in order to be used, because it will now use durability. And that overall might be considered as a major nerf, because you might think, oh, I'm losing that 50% extra damage that an ethereal weapon provides. But the skill of Echoing Strike uses flat damage or adds flat damage to your attack, and that is one of the major contributing factors to the amount of damage you're doing. So it's more the flat damage that's added by Echoing Strike than the damage on your weapon. That's only a small portion, so you're only really losing out about 12.5% or so damage here. And just to note, any of these calculations that I am quoting in this video are from the Macrobioboi video that was released recently, and I'll put a link in the description. He has done all the calculations for estimations excuse me, for estimations of how Echoing Strike is affected by the current proposed changes. So you're not really losing that ethereal 50% damage increase, you're only losing about 12.5% damage because of how Echoing Strike scales and works with its flat damage that it is added to your overall damage. So again, sort of weapon choices are going to be changed so much, like showing Obsession again here. This has no combat oriented stats on it, so it doesn't have deadly strike, it doesn't have attack rating, it doesn't have enhanced damage, all of those things. So now weapons that have these combat oriented stats are going to be a lot more important and become a lot more relevant for the Echoing Strike build overall. So saying what weapon will be best right now would really be a thumbsuck. We're going to have to do testing and see what actually works out. But all you can take away from this is that weapons will be changing substantially in terms of what we thought was good before. I think Insight will still remain very relevant, but at the moment it's hard to say. But yeah, now weapons use durability. So for instance, a Frenzy Barbarian would go through durability so quickly because they are attacking so fast, and Echoing Strike is similar in that manner, where it's very fast, very sort of rapid attacking that could potentially go through your durability very quickly, which would mean frequent visits to town, which would overall just sort of mess with the efficacy of this build. So it's a big thing to consider, that use of durability, now that they have added or fixed the bug of. So moving on to the third point now of this video, and that is how the synergies for Echoing Strike are reduced from 5% to 3%. So for instance, you get 5% damage from Mirrored Blades and Blade Warp. Now you will only be getting 3% damage increases from these synergies for Echoing Strike. And I mean, it's hard to again calculate what sort of a damage loss this would be overall, but maybe let's just take it as 10%. And the big part of this damage loss is actually again that flat damage that Echoing Strike is providing. So that is just another nerf again to the build as a whole, because these synergies aren't providing the full 5% that they were currently. They are now going to be providing 3%. So this isn't one of the biggest changes, but it is still a nerf and still a change to the build. So looking at the fourth point of the video now, this is probably one of the biggest contributing factors to the nerf of Echoing Strike and how much damage it will output in the upcoming patch. So damage has now been made additive and not multiplicative, and that's a theme in Diablo that is one of the sort of core mechanics to understand, is additive versus multiplicative damage. And where the skill used to do your damage multiplied by Echoing Strike skill damage, it is now your damage plus Echoing Strike skill damage. So it's not multiplied, it is just added to your damage bucket. So what that basically means now is that you will only be doing 22.5%, I think that is the correct math that Macrobioboi quoted, and you will only be doing 22.5% damage that you were currently doing in the current state of the game. So you're not losing 22% damage, you're only doing 22% damage of what you were before. So that is almost a 5 times less damage calculation, or you are doing 5 times less damage than you were. So that is probably one of the biggest changes and the biggest nerfs to the character is, or not to the character, but to Echoing Strike in particular, is that we are now only doing 22% damage of whatever we were before. So yeah, just changing the damage sort of equation there from multiplicative to additive is definitely a huge loss for Echoing Strike. Next up, we're going to look at Sigil Lethargy, and where currently Sigil Lethargy says damage taken by 39%, what that is actually doing behind the scene and behind in the calculations is it's minusing 39 from your enemy's physical resistance. So 39% of your enemy's physical resistance. And this would firstly break physical immunities, as well as just on any monster minusing that physical resistance, and this is now being taken away, so you won't get that including damage taken stat on Sigil Lethargy. That is being completely taken away, and this again relates in a nerf to our damage output as an Echoing Strike Warlock. So it's about a 30% damage decrease or debuff on regular monsters, and if it was on monsters that were physical immune, it would be about a 40% damage loss. So overall, this is also one of the major sort of knocks that Echoing Strike has incurred with these proposed changes. And I think even though it was quite overpowered in its current state, this is quite a massive change to the skill or to the whole build in its entirety, and it's just Sigil Lethargy just somehow loses quite a bit of its punch now, although it is still a very strong crowd control effect and crowd control skill. So this is going to be a big one, and what's funny is that now, whilst this was used in Echoing Strike builds to break immunities and on bosses or targets with a lot of health just to shred them down quicker, we still are now going to have to use Sigil Lethargy more than we ever did before, because we are going to need it for that minus enemy defense and in order to hit monsters. So even though it's getting nerfed, we are going to have to use the skill more, which is quite a sort of, I don't know, funny, paradoxical kind of thing. So that was our 5th point. Moving on to the 6th point, Bind Demon is now going to require 15 hard points in order to bind a unique demon. And why I mention a unique demon, that's because this demon can then have cursed and or an aura, and that is ultimately what you are going to want for your Echoing Strike build. So if you do want a strong bound demon who can give you lots of good buffs and auras and all of those sorts of things, you are going to at least have, or need to at least have, 15 hard points into Bind Demon. Because how the whole new sort of system works, if I just look at the notes here quickly, where are we? Chaos, Bind Demon. So Bind Demon now requires 10 skill points in order to bind a champion, 15 in order to bind a unique monster, and 20 points, hard points that is, to bind a super unique. So this is going to change up things a lot, because firstly, whilst you're playing Echoing Strike, especially in the playthrough, you're going to be maxing Echoing Strike and its synergies, and you're not going to be able to just put this 1-point wonder into Bind Demon and be able to bind any demon that you want. So now there's going to be a lot more sort of theory crafting and a lot more thought going into how you are speccing and building your character, because you aren't just going to have so many free points and points just to do 1-point wonders like Bind Demon was in the current state of the game. So this is a huge sort of drawback to the Echoing Strike build now, because you're going to have to be a higher level in order to get the right Bound Demon that you want, or sacrifice a lot of synergies and damage. So again, it's just a big decision to make along the process of building your Echoing Strike Warlock now. And with this in mind, the 8th point of the video now is how your Bind Demon can only have the Fanaticism aura, the Concentration aura, the Thorns aura, the Holy Freeze aura, and the Vigor aura. So this again is a net nerf because of the auras that you have available at your disposal. So you no longer have Holy Fire to proc your amp damage curse or Holy Shock to proc it. You only have Holy Freeze, and you also no longer have Conviction, whether you're a Fire Warlock and whatever, but we're talking about Echoing Strike, so we'll forgo that tangent at the moment. But anyway, you now have to decide on a smaller pool of auras, and with that, our 9th point of the video is also how these auras are only proccing your Bound Demon curse 5% of the time versus 75% of the time, which it used to be in the current state of the game. So if we see here, the cursed affix chance to cast Amplify Damage skill is reduced to 5% from 75%. So if you didn't have an elemental aura proccing amp damage like you do right now, or in the current state of the game, your demon would only have a 1 in 20 chance when hitting an enemy to proc amp damage if it doesn't have an aura to assist in proccing that damage. So your amount of procs that you are getting off is greatly reduced, and you only now have the Holy Freeze aura to assist with proccing amp damage, and it will require larger mobs to get a good chance to proc this. And with the other changes that we mentioned to the demon skill tree and Bound Demon, you will not have as many points to easily just bind any sort of champion, any sort of super unique or anything like that. So it's just become a lot more challenging to get a good Bound Demon with the specific stats that you need in order to boost your damage as an Echoing Strike Warlock. So they've made that a lot more challenging, and they also made it that Demonic Mastery now requires more hard points, or requires hard points, not soft points, to get to your max demons that you can have active at any one time. So before, you could just get 20 soft points into Demonic Mastery, and then you would be able to have 3 demons. Now you need hard points into Demonic Mastery, so you're not going to be able to as easily have a Consumed Goatman, a Defiler, and a Bound Demon. You will have to likely choose between possibly consuming a Goatman and just a Bound Demon, or just having a Bound Demon, depending on where you are in the game. So overall, the whole demon skill tree is no longer this sort of current meta where every warlock is a demon warlock as well as either a fire warlock or an abyss warlock or an echoing strike warlock. At the moment, in the current meta, 1 skill point into all of the demon skills was enough to be sufficient in having an unkillable Bound Demon, a great Defiler, good Consume, good Blood Oath, all the rest of that. It's now going to shift from being a dual sort of hybrid warlock of both a demon summon warlock and whatever else, to being a lot more focused with very particular choices put into the demon skill tree. So again, just summing that up in a nutshell, you will basically need to be a lot more careful where you put your points in the demon skill tree, and you won't be able to access powerful demons early on and during the playthrough of the game. So this ultimately makes the warlock not have that big meat tank that it had to absorb damage before, so we become more squishy, which also then lets us output damage at a lesser rate. and it won't as easily provide us the useful auras and curses that we have, which also nets us less damage overall. Now, the last point I'm going to make here is how any Warlock can just have a two-handed weapon and any sort of shield or whatever it is in its offhand, and you can just go blasting and do whatever you need. They have now changed it so that you can only have a grimoire or a tome, a book, whatever you want to call it, and a two-handed weapon together, not a shield and a two-handed weapon. So I personally think this is not a big change at all, because in the end game you are only using the Ars Dual Mephistos, that is best in slot, or the Ars Dual or Ars whatever, Diablos, whatever you want to call them. You only are using these books. You aren't using any of the shields really, other than Phoenix maybe for a Firebolt or an Echoing Strike Bolt or something like that. But ultimately, I don't think that's the biggest nerf, because in my opinion, the best in slot items are these books. And the only time that this is going to become a major sort of implication is during the playthrough, when you want to slap on a Spirit Shield, or you want to use an Ancient's Pledge, or any of those sort of like playthrough items. I mean, yes, Spirit is also endgame, but that is where you're going to be affected more by this change than in the end game, where books are sort of your best in slot anyway. So that sort of sums up the changes, and taking everything into account that we just mentioned, the ultimate takeaway, and this was the maths that Macrobioboi sort of deducted and came to a conclusion on, is that as an Echoing Strike Warlock, we are probably going to be doing 1/10 of the damage overall that we were currently doing in the current state of the game before patch 3.2. Now, that might come as a shocking figure to you, 1/10 of the damage. That feels like it's been nerfed into the ground. They've absolutely just bombed this build and now it's useless. And I think, as well as many other people, that even with all the mentioned changes that we talked about in this video, and every nerf that has been applied to Echoing Strike and the bug fixes that they have done, I think that this build and this skill could still even be overpowered with all the intended changes. And that would be a really interesting thing to test and to find out. And I strongly believe, and I'll say it here first before the patch even comes out, that I don't think this is even enough changes to put Echoing Strike in a balanced state versus all the other builds in the game. I think it's still going to be overpowered. So you can quote me on this when further testing is done. That is my belief and my prediction for this. And I just think that, yeah, a lot of people who are complaining with these changes and saying that, we're ruining the Warlock and all of those sorts of things. I mean, if you just look at how just the bug fixes have dropped the damage and nerfing the damage of Echoing Strike, those weren't intentional. The build was never supposed to be as strong as it currently is, or as broken as it currently is, because most of the sort of big changes in terms of reducing damage are all bug fixes. They're not intentional nerfs by Blizzard. It was stuff that slipped through the cracks when the Warlock was released. And I think that in its entirety, bringing the Warlock power level more in line and more balanced versus the other classes in the game and the other builds in the game is important to keep the integrity of Diablo 2 Resurrected as a game. Because even arguing that it will be less approachable to casual players and all of those things, if you only have one build that is head and shoulders, magnitudes above the rest, it makes the game very one-dimensional and very boring. And that is at least my opinion. And another observation just to make on all of this is, I found it funny how it wasn't mentioned or brought up in the patch notes at all about deadly strike, crushing blow, open wounds, lifesteal, mana steal, all the leeches, all of that sort of stuff, on hit effects, how those interact with Echoing Strike. Because when the testing was done, when the Warlock was released, everyone quickly found out that Crushing Blow doesn't apply and Deadly Strike does apply, and you know, seeing what effects work with Echoing Strike, and there was no mention in the current patch notes of the mechanics that work or don't work with Echoing Strike. So it will be interesting to see if there are any changes in that regard with the patch 3.2 and what's going to happen in relation to that coming in the coming future now. So it will be interesting. Maybe they do add Crushing Blow onto the list of effects that work with it. Maybe they do that amp damage procs with, if you're using a Reaper Toll, would work with Echoing Strikes. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. That's where we're going to wrap this up. I personally think the Warlock and the Echoing Strike build is still in a great place, and I'm excited to do all the testing and play a bit of the PTR and bring you more content, and just keen to see where everything is going, because I personally think all these changes were necessary and have been done in a well thought out manner. And just a last note, just before we end off this video, I have recently added a new members and membership part of our YouTube channel. So if you'd like to support the channel further, please consider becoming a member. You will get perks like early access videos, members only live streams, icons in our live stream chats, all sorts of good perks and cool things going on. If you become a member, you'll get a lot of early access to content and one-on-one live chats, one-on-one games together, or not one-on-one, but you know, closer, more intimate sort of interactions with myself and the channel. So if you would like to support the channel by becoming a member, I would greatly appreciate that. And just anyway, thank you very much to anyone who is enjoying this content, viewing this content, sharing, liking, all of that good stuff. If you did enjoy this video and any of our other content and you aren't subscribed yet, please consider doing so, and we will catch you again very soon for some more Mana and Motherboards. Cheers!